Hey guys, tonight we're descending into the darkest corners of human history. A world where justice wore iron masks, where hope died in windowless towers, and where the phrase cruel and unusual punishment hadn't been invented yet because cruelty was just Tuesday. We're exploring medieval prisons, dungeons, and torture chambers that make modern maximum security facilities look like luxury resorts with really bad Wi-Fi. Before you get comfortable in your heated home with running water and constitutional rights, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to join us on these historical deep dives. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's brave enough to venture into humanity's darker chapters with us. Now dim the lights, maybe grab something warm to drink, and prepare yourself for a journey through medieval justice that will make you grateful for every modern legal protection you've ever taken for granted. Because tonight, we're not just talking about prisons, we're talking about places where human dignity went to die, slowly, publicly, and often spectacularly. Picture this. You've just been accused of stealing a loaf of bread. Maybe you did it, maybe you didn't. In the medieval world, that distinction matters less than you'd hope. What matters is that someone with authority thinks you did it, and now you're about to discover what passes for criminal justice in an age where due process was about as common as indoor plumbing. The medieval legal system wasn't designed around concepts we take for granted today. Innocent until proven guilty? That's adorable legal representation. You mean like having your drinking buddy speak up for you while the judge decides whether to hang you or just cut off your hand? The presumption of innocence was a luxury reserved for the nobility, and even they weren't guaranteed a fair shake. Medieval justice was swift, brutal, and deeply personal. It was less about rehabilitation and more about revenge, deterrence, and providing entertainment for the masses. Think of it as reality TV meets public execution with a legal system that would make Judge Judy weep for the good old days. Most prisoners weren't waiting for trial. They were waiting to be punished. And that punishment wasn't going to be community service or anger management classes. We're talking about a world where breaking into someone's house could cost you your eyes, where counterfeiting money meant being boiled alive, and where treason earned you a guided tour of your own internal organs while you were still conscious to appreciate the craftsmanship. The concept of prison as we know it barely existed. Most medieval communities didn't have the resources to feed and house criminals long term. Instead, they had holding cells, brief stopovers on the way to more permanent solutions. These weren't rehabilitation centers. They were human storage units designed to keep you alive just long enough to face whatever creative punishment the local authorities had cooked up. But for those unlucky enough to be imprisoned for extended periods, medieval jails were masterclasses in human suffering. They were places where hope went to die slowly in conditions that would make a medieval pig refuse to live there. And the worst part? The prisoners often had to pay for their own accommodations. That's right, you had to pay rent to suffer in a windowless stone box that smelled like death and despair. So as we embark on this tour through medieval imprisonment, remember, every horror we're about to explore was someone's idea of justice. Every torture device was someone's solution to crime. Every dungeon was built by people who thought they were making the world a better place, one broken bone at a time. Medieval prisons weren't built with rehabilitation in mind. They were constructed with one goal: to make existence as miserable as possible while keeping the prisoner alive long enough to face whatever punishment awaited them. These weren't buildings, they were monuments to human cruelty, carved from stone and designed by architects who clearly failed their compassion classes. Let's start with the classic medieval dungeon, a word that comes from the French donjon, meaning the main tower of a castle. Ironic, since these dungeons were typically located in the deepest, darkest parts of castles, as far from the main living areas as possible. Out of sight, out of mind, out of hope. These underground chambers were carved directly from bedrock, or built with massive stone blocks that wept moisture year-round. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams and strong enough to crush spirits. There were no windows, no fresh air, no natural light. Just perpetual darkness broken only by the flickering flame of an occasional torch, or the pale glow of sunlight filtering down through iron grates in the ceiling. The floors were often bare earth or rough stone, soaked with centuries of human waste, vomit, blood, and tears. Prisoners slept directly on these surfaces with straw if they were lucky, on their own filth if they weren't. The air was thick with the smell of decay, unwashed bodies, and despair so thick you could practically taste it. Most dungeons were tiny, often no larger than a modern bathroom, but designed to hold multiple prisoners. Privacy was a myth. Personal space was a luxury. Human dignity was checked at the iron door and never returned. The famous Tower of London had several types of imprisonment options, like a medieval bed and breakfast from hell. The Salt Tower, Bosham Tower, and the infamous Bloody Tower each offered their own unique flavor of misery. Some had fireplaces if you were nobility. Most had nothing but damp stone walls covered in the carved messages of previous prisoners, medieval graffiti scratched by fingernails or smuggled nails, final words from people who knew they'd never see sunlight again. Then there were the oubliettes, from the French oublier, meaning to forget. These were vertical shafts carved into bedrock, narrow enough that prisoners couldn't lie down comfortably, deep enough that escape was impossible, and designed specifically to be forgotten. Prisoners were lowered in and left to die, slowly, in darkness, with no human contact except for the occasional bucket of water or scrap of mouldy bread lowered on a rope. Castle dungeons like those at Warwick Castle or Chillon Castle in Switzerland became legendary for their creative cruelty. Some featured iron rings embedded in walls for chaining prisoners. Others had built-in torture devices, convenient amenities for the discriminating jailer. Many had drainage systems, not for sanitation, but to wash away blood and waste when things got too messy. The Mamertine prison in Rome, though technically ancient rather than medieval, set the standard for miserable incarceration. 2 levels of underground chambers, accessed only through holes in the ceiling, where prisoners were lowered like cargo and left to contemplate their sins in total darkness. Legend says both St. Peter and St. Paul were imprisoned there, which tells you something about the company you'd be keeping. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval prison architecture was its permanence. These weren't temporary holding facilities, they were built to last centuries, and many did. Walking into a medieval dungeon meant accepting that you might never walk out. The thick walls, iron doors, and stone construction sent a clear message: abandonment. Hope was not welcome here. Every architectural choice was designed to break the human spirit. Low ceilings to prevent standing upright, narrow spaces to prevent movement, no light to prevent seeing the full horror of your situation, no ventilation to ensure you'd smell your own decay. These weren't accidents of construction, they were features, carefully planned elements in a system designed to make death seem like mercy. The builders of these prisons understood something about human psychology that modern architects try to forget. Environment shapes experience. They created spaces that turned time into torture, solitude into madness, and survival into suffering. They built monuments to human cruelty that would outlast the kingdoms that created them. And the most chilling part? Many of these dungeons still exist today, preserved as historical sites and tourist attractions. You can visit them, walk through them, touch the walls where prisoners carved their names or prayers or final words, but you can leave whenever you want. The people who built these walls made sure their original occupants never could. Not all medieval prisoners were created equal. Your social status, your crime, and your connections determined whether you'd be housed in a damp stone cell with a window or buried alive in an oubliette with a death sentence. Medieval prisons operated on a strict class system that made modern wealth inequality look like a minor inconvenience. At the top of the prisoner hierarchy were the political prisoners, usually nobility, who had backed the wrong side in a civil war or committed treason against their monarch. These VIP inmates often enjoyed relatively comfortable accommodations, sometimes even keeping their servants, receiving visitors, and dining on food sent from their estates. The Tower of London's more famous prisoners, like Sir Walter Raleigh, lived in apartments that were nicer than most commoners' homes. But don't mistake this for kindness. Even noble prisoners faced execution, just with better meals beforehand. Anne Boleyn spent her final days in the Tower with her own servants and chaplain, but she still ended up on the executioner's block. The comfortable prison was often just a luxurious waiting room for death. Religious prisoners formed another special category. Heretics, priests who had fallen out of favor, and anyone accused of witchcraft faced particular horrors because their crimes were considered offenses against God himself. The medieval mind saw religious crimes as cosmic violations that demanded cosmic punishment. These prisoners were often subjected to torture, not just to punish them, but to save their souls through suffering. The Inquisition perfected this approach, creating elaborate theological justifications for breaking human beings in the name of salvation. Their prisons were laboratories of pain where torture was rebranded as spiritual medicine. The idea was that if you suffered enough in this life, you might avoid worse suffering in the next. It was the medieval equivalent of "this hurts me more than it hurts you," except they weren't your parents, and the hurt involved red-hot irons. Then you had the common criminals, thieves, murderers, forgers, and anyone who had the misfortune to be poor and accused of something. These prisoners enjoyed none of the amenities of their social betters. They were packed into communal cells like human cargo, chained to walls or floors, and left to survive on whatever scraps their families could afford to bring them. Because here's a detail that makes medieval imprisonment even more horrifying. Prisoners had to pay for their own food, bedding, and sometimes even their chains. Jailers weren't salaried employees of the state. They were entrepreneurs who made money by charging prisoners for every service, including the service of keeping them alive. Can't afford bread? Starve. Can't pay for straw bedding? Sleep on stone. Can't afford to have your chains loosened? Learn to love the feeling of iron cutting into your wrists. This created a particularly cruel dynamic, where the wealthy could buy their way to relative comfort, while the poor died of neglect. Justice wasn't blind, it was pay to play. Rich prisoners could bribe guards for better treatment, extra food, or even temporary release to handle business affairs. Poor prisoners watched their own flesh rot away from malnutrition and infected wounds. Women, prisoners faced additional horrors. Sexual assault by guards was so common it was practically considered a job perk. Pregnant women gave birth in chains, often without assistance, and their children were raised in prison until they were old enough to be sold into servitude or apprenticed to trades. Being born in a medieval prison was like starting life with negative points in a game where everyone else began at zero. Children were imprisoned alongside adults for crimes as minor as stealing fruit or bread. The medieval world had no concept of juvenile justice. A 10-year-old thief faced the same punishments as an adult: branding, mutilation, or death. Some prisons had sections where children were chained alongside hardened criminals, learning advanced techniques in crime and despair from their cellmates. Debtors formed a large portion of the prison population, people whose only crime was being too poor to pay their bills. They were imprisoned until they could settle their debts, which was impossible since they couldn't earn money while chained in a dungeon. It was a perfect system for creating permanent prisoners, a sort of medieval payday loan arrangement where the collateral was your freedom and your life. Foreign prisoners, captured soldiers or travelers accused of crimes faced particular prejudice. They had no local connections, no family to bring food or pay bribes, and no understanding of local customs or language. They often died of neglect simply because no one cared enough to keep them alive. The irony is that many prisoners were there for crimes that wouldn't even be illegal today. Owing money, practicing the wrong religion, criticizing the king, or being accused of witchcraft by a neighbor with a grudge. The medieval criminal justice system cast a wide net and caught everyone from actual murderers to people whose only crime was being inconvenient to someone with power. And once you were inside, your status could change instantly based on politics, new accusations, or the mood of your captors. A political prisoner could become a common criminal overnight. A religious prisoner could be upgraded to heretic and face torture. The only thing certain about medieval imprisonment was that certainty itself was a luxury you couldn't afford. This wasn't a system designed to create justice. It was a system designed to maintain order through fear, to generate revenue through extortion, and to provide entertainment through public suffering. The prisoners were just raw material in a machine that turned human beings into cautionary tales. Waking up in a medieval prison wasn't really waking up, since you never properly slept. It was more like transitioning from one form of consciousness to another, neither of them pleasant. There was no dawn in the dungeons, no morning routine, no schedule beyond the arbitrary whims of your captors and the relentless rhythm of your own deteriorating body. Your day began, if you can call it that, with an assessment of what hurt less than it did when you lost consciousness. Did your chains cut deeper into your wrists overnight? Were the rats bolder in the darkness? Had the prisoner chained next to you stopped breathing, meaning you'd be spending the foreseeable future next to a decomposing corpse? Food, when it came, arrived on no schedule you could predict. A guard might appear once a day, twice a day, or not at all for several days. They carried buckets of what generously could be called soup, but more accurately resembled dishwater with floating bits of unidentifiable organic matter. This slop was ladled into wooden bowls that were rarely cleaned and often shared among multiple prisoners. The quality of food depended entirely on your ability to pay. If your family could afford to bribe the guards, you might receive bread that was only partly moldy, cheese that hadn't completely turned, or even occasional scraps of meat. If you couldn't pay, you got whatever the guards felt like giving you, which was usually the worst refuse from the kitchens mixed with water to create a substance that would keep you alive but miserable. Water was another luxury. Clean drinking water was rare even in the best medieval circumstances, but prison water was actively dangerous. It came from wells that were often contaminated with waste, or from buckets that had been used for cleaning cells, carrying waste, or worse. Many prisoners died not from starvation, but from drinking water that was more poison than hydration. Sanitation was a concept that hadn't made it to medieval prisons. There were no toilets, no privacy, no dignity. Prisoners relieved themselves wherever they were chained, often in the same space where they ate and slept. The floors became layers of human waste, vomit, blood, and decomposing matter that created a toxic environment that bred disease and despair. The smell was indescribable. Imagine the worst public restroom you've ever encountered, multiply it by 1,000, add the scent of unwashed human bodies, infected wounds, and death, then lock yourself in a small space with that smell for months or years. Prisoners often lost their sense of smell entirely, which was probably a mercy. Disease spread through medieval prisons like wildfire through dry grass. Dysentery, typhus, plague, and tuberculosis killed more prisoners than executions ever did. Wounds became infected and turned gangrenous. Minor illnesses became death sentences. The medical care consisted of prayer, if you were lucky, or being left to die if you weren't. Mental health was ignored entirely. The medieval world had no understanding of psychological trauma, depression, or the effects of prolonged isolation and abuse. Prisoners who developed what we'd now recognize as severe mental illness were simply considered possessed by demons or punishment from God. Some were chained more securely. Others were left to rave in corners until they died of exhaustion. Social dynamics in medieval prisons were brutal. The strong preyed on the weak, the experienced on the newcomers, the well-connected on the abandoned. Guards often encouraged violence among prisoners as entertainment. Fights over scraps of food, better sleeping spots, or simple dominance were common and vicious. Sleep was impossible in any normal sense. The stone floors were freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. The air was thick with the sounds of coughing, crying, praying, and cursing in multiple languages. Rats scurried constantly across sleeping bodies. The lucky prisoners had straw mattresses that they shared with fleas, lice, and whatever else had made a home there. The darkness was absolute in most dungeons. No candles, no torches, no windows. Prisoners lost track of time completely. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. Some prisoners carved marks on walls to count days, but most lost interest in time as a meaningful concept. When every moment is suffering, time becomes irrelevant. The cold was bone-deep and constant. Medieval heating systems didn't extend to dungeons. Stone walls and floors conducted cold like they were designed for it. Prisoners huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat with people they might have avoided in normal circumstances. Class distinctions mattered less when everyone was freezing to death. Communication with the outside world was rare and expensive. Letters had to be smuggled out by guards who demanded payment. Visitors were charged fees for the privilege of seeing their loved ones waste away. Many prisoners simply disappeared from the memories of their families, forgotten as if they'd never existed. The psychological torture of medieval imprisonment was as devastating as the physical conditions. Hope was systematically destroyed through arbitrary cruelty, unpredictable treatment, and the constant reminder that you were completely powerless. Guards might be kind one day and vicious the next. Promises of release were made and broken. Prisoners were told their families had abandoned them, whether it was true or not. Some prisoners tried to maintain their sanity through ritual prayer or mental exercises. They recited poems, told stories to cellmates, or created elaborate fantasies of life after prison. Others retreated into madness as a form of escape. A few became so institutionalized that they feared release more than continued imprisonment. This was daily life in a medieval prison, a methodical destruction of human dignity designed to break people physically, mentally, and spiritually. It wasn't incarceration. It was slow-motion execution with an uncertain timeline. And the most terrifying part was that it could go on indefinitely as long as someone found it useful to keep you alive and suffering. Medieval torture wasn't just about extracting confessions or punishing crimes. It was an art form, a science, and a public spectacle, all rolled into one horrifying package. The torture chamber was the medieval equivalent of a research and development lab, except instead of developing products, they were perfecting methods of human suffering. The medieval mind had a twisted genius for innovation when it came to causing pain. They understood human anatomy better than you might expect, not through medical study, but through centuries of practical experimentation on living subjects. They knew exactly how much pain a human body could endure without dying, and they pushed right up to that limit. Let's start with the rack, probably the most famous of medieval torture devices. Picture a wooden frame about the size of a bed, with rollers at each end connected to gears and handles. The victim was strapped down with ropes tied to their wrists and ankles, then slowly stretched as the rollers turned in opposite directions. The genius of the rack was its gradualism. You didn't die quickly. Instead, you experienced every stage of your body's destruction in excruciating detail. First, your joints would start to ache as they were pulled beyond their natural range. Then the pain would intensify as ligaments stretched and began to tear. Next came the popping sounds as joints dislocated, shoulders, hips, knees, ankles, all pulled from their sockets in sequence. If the torturer was feeling merciful, they might stop there, leaving you permanently disabled but alive. If not, they continued until your spine separated and your limbs literally tore away from your torso. The rack was particularly popular because it was adjustable. Torturers could calibrate the exact amount of suffering based on their goals. Need a quick confession? A few turns might do it. Want to make an example of someone? Stretch them out over several hours while crowds gathered to watch and learn. Then there was the Iron Maiden, though historical evidence suggests it was more of a 19th century invention inspired by medieval methods rather than an actual medieval device. But medieval torturers had plenty of real spiked contraptions that served similar purposes. The Spanish boot, for instance, was a metal device that encased the leg and was gradually tightened with screws until it crushed bones and forced spikes through flesh. The wheel was another crowd favorite. Victims were tied to large wooden wheels and their limbs were broken with hammers or iron bars. Then the wheel was mounted vertically for public display. The idea was to break every major bone in the body while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. Skilled torturers could keep someone conscious and screaming for hours. Fire was always popular because it was cheap, readily available, and spectacularly effective. Red-hot irons were used to brand flesh, cauterize wounds to prevent bleeding out, or simply applied to sensitive areas for maximum pain. Some torture chambers had specialized furnaces for heating various implements. Others used hot coals, boiling oil, or molten metal poured over the body. The strappado was elegantly simple in its cruelty. Victims' hands were tied behind their backs. Then they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The weight of their body pulled their shoulders from their sockets while cutting off circulation to their arms. For variety, weights were sometimes attached to their feet to increase the stretching force, or they were dropped suddenly and caught just before hitting the ground, causing even more joint damage. Water torture took many forms, all of them horrible. The Chinese water torture involved dripping water constantly onto the same spot on a victim's forehead until it drove them insane. More aggressive versions involved forcing massive quantities of water down the victim's throat until their stomach distended painfully, then beating the swollen belly. Others involved near drowning, followed by resuscitation, repeated until the victim confessed or died. The thumbscrew was portable torture, a small device that crushed fingers or toes with gradually increasing pressure. It was popular with traveling inquisitors because it fit in a bag and could be used anywhere. The pain was intense, the damage was visible, and it rarely killed the victim outright, making it perfect for extracting confessions. Medieval torturers also understood psychological manipulation. They often showed victims the instruments that would be used on them, describing in detail what each device would do to their body. They tortured family members in front of each other, or threatened to harm children unless parents confessed. Sometimes the threat of torture was more effective than the torture itself. The creativity was endless and deeply disturbing. There were devices for crushing skulls, tearing flesh, breaking bones, burning skin, and destroying every part of the human body you can imagine, and some you probably can't. Many torture chambers looked like workshops with specialized tools hanging from walls and detailed instruction manuals for their use. Professional torturers were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. They knew anatomy, they understood pain thresholds, and they could keep someone conscious and suffering for longer than seemed humanly possible. Some maintained detailed records of their techniques, creating how-to guides for future generations of sadists. The most disturbing aspect of medieval torture was its legal legitimacy. This wasn't random violence or sadistic entertainment. though it certainly served both purposes. It was an officially sanctioned part of the judicial system, endorsed by churches and governments, regulated by laws and procedures. Torture was considered a necessary tool for discovering truth, despite the obvious fact that people will say anything to stop unbearable pain. The medieval legal system preferred forced confessions to actual evidence, and torture was the most efficient way to obtain those confessions. Never mind that innocent people confessed to crimes they never committed, or that guilty people pointed fingers at innocents to redirect attention. The torture chamber wasn't just a place of physical suffering, it was where human dignity went to die, where civilized society showed its true face, and where the pretense of justice was stripped away to reveal the raw exercise of power over the powerless. It was humanity at its absolute worst, systematized and made official. Some medieval prisons became so notorious that their names alone could terrify criminals across Europe. These weren't just buildings, they were legends, cautionary tales whispered in taverns and used by parents to frighten children into obedience. Let's take a tour through some of history's most infamous dungeons. The Tower of London stands as perhaps the most famous medieval prison in the world, and with good reason. Built by William the Conqueror in 1078, it served as royal residence, fortress, armory, treasury, and prison, all in one convenient location. But it was the prison function that made it legendary. The tower wasn't just a single prison, but a complex of buildings housing different types of prisoners in varying degrees of comfort and misery. The Salt Tower, Beauchamp Tower, and Bloody Tower each had their own reputations for specific types of suffering. The walls are still covered with graffiti carved by prisoners, religious symbols, names, dates, and final messages to families they'd never see again. Some of the tower's most famous prisoners included Anne Boleyn, who spent her final days in the Queen's house before being executed on Tower Green. Sir Thomas More was imprisoned there for opposing Henry VIII's break with Rome, spending 15 months in a cell before his execution. The two young princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, disappeared within the tower's walls, presumably murdered on the orders of their uncle, Richard III. But the tower also housed countless unknown prisoners, common criminals, and political inconveniences who rotted away in its depths without anyone recording their names or stories. The Bloody Tower earned its name not from any single event, but from centuries of accumulated violence and death. Château d'If, off the coast of Marseille, became famous through Alexandre Dumas' novel The Count of Monte Cristo, but the real prison was far worse than fiction. Built in the 16th century, it was designed specifically as a prison for political prisoners and religious dissidents. The fortress sat on a rocky island, making escape virtually impossible. Prisoners at Château d'If were classified by their social status and their crimes. The wealthy were housed in upper chambers with windows and relatively decent conditions. The poor were locked in lower dungeons carved directly from rock, with no light, no heat, and minimal food. Many prisoners went insane from the isolation and the constant sound of waves crashing against the walls. The Bastille in Paris started as a fortress but evolved into France's most feared prison. It became synonymous with royal tyranny and arbitrary imprisonment. The Bastille was where the king sent people who had displeased him, often without trial or formal charges. Prisoners were held by lettres de cachet, royal orders that could imprison someone indefinitely without explanation. Despite its fearsome reputation, the Bastille was actually more comfortable than most prisons. Wealthy prisoners could bring servants, receive visitors, and live in relative luxury. But the psychological torture of not knowing when or if you'd be released drove many prisoners mad. The mystery surrounding their crimes and their fates became part of the Bastille's legend. Carcassonne in southern France contained one of Europe's most notorious Inquisition prisons. The fortress city's dungeons were specifically designed for processing heretics. The Inquisition had perfected the art of breaking people through isolation, interrogation, and systematic torture. Prisoners at Carcassonne were kept in complete darkness for months or years. They were interrogated repeatedly about their beliefs, their associates, and their crimes against God. Many confessed to heresies they'd never committed. Others confessed to real crimes but implicated innocent friends and family members to stop the torture. Newgate Prison in London was rebuilt multiple times throughout the medieval period, each iteration more horrifying than the last. It became synonymous with disease, corruption, and death. Prisoners were packed into communal cells with no sanitation, no heat, and barely enough food to survive. The prison operated on a fee system where everything cost money. Want a bed? Pay the jailer. Need food that won't kill you? Pay more. Want your chains loosened? Keep paying. Prisoners who couldn't afford these fees were left to die of neglect. Those who could pay lived marginally better but still faced execution or transportation. Edinburgh Tolbooth served as Scotland's primary prison for centuries. The building combined courthouse, prison and execution site in one convenient location. Prisoners were tried, convicted, and executed without ever leaving the building, a sort of medieval one-stop justice shop. The Tolbooth was notorious for its overcrowding and disease. Prisoners were crammed into cells designed for far fewer people. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and death. Disease spread so rapidly that being sentenced to the Tolbooth was often a death sentence regardless of your actual crime. Chillon Castle in Switzerland perfected the art of the oubliette. These vertical dungeons carved into bedrock were accessed only through holes in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered in and forgotten, left to die slowly in complete darkness. The castle's location on Lake Geneva meant the dungeons were constantly damp and cold, accelerating the prisoners' deaths. The Doge's Palace in Venice housed one of Europe's most sophisticated prison systems. The famous Bridge of Sighs connected the courthouse to the prison, allowing condemned prisoners one final glimpse of beautiful Venice before disappearing into the dungeons forever. The prison was built with lead-lined cells that were stifling hot in summer and freezing cold in winter. The lead poisoned the air, causing slow death even for prisoners who weren't executed. The cells were so small that prisoners couldn't stand upright or lie down comfortably, a design feature intended to prevent rest or comfort. Each of these prisons developed its own culture of cruelty, its own innovations in human suffering, and its own legends of horror. They weren't just buildings, they were institutions dedicated to breaking human beings as efficiently as possible. Their reputations spread across Europe, serving as warnings to potential criminals and dissidents. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these famous prisons was how ordinary they were considered. They weren't aberrations or exceptions, they were standard features of medieval justice. Every major city had its own version, its own methods, and its own stories of horror that local people accepted as necessary parts of civilization. These prisons didn't just house criminals, they defined what justice meant in the medieval world. They were physical manifestations of power, fear, and social control. And their legends persist today, reminding us how thin the line between civilization and barbarity can be when power goes unchecked. Medieval imprisonment wasn't just about justice or punishment, it was big business. The prison system operated on a for-profit model that would make modern private prison companies blush. Every aspect of incarceration was designed to generate revenue, from the initial arrest to the final execution, creating perverse incentives that turned human suffering into a commodity. Let's start with the basic business model. Prisoners paid for everything. And I mean everything. Your cell, that's rent, your food, a la carte pricing, your chains, equipment rental fees, even the privilege of being executed quickly instead of slowly required a substantial bribe. It was like a medieval subscription service where the only thing you subscribed to was misery. Jailers weren't salaried employees of the state. They were entrepreneurs who purchased their positions and then recouped their investment by extracting as much money as possible from their captive customers. A jailer position was considered a valuable business opportunity, often passed down through families or sold to the highest bidder. The fee schedule was exhaustively detailed and ruthlessly enforced. At Newgate Prison in London, prisoners paid easement money just to have their chains loosened. They paid chamber rent for access to better cells. They paid garnish money as an entry fee to avoid being stripped naked and beaten by other prisoners. They paid for bedding, for candles, for the privilege of receiving visitors, and even for the right to walk in prison yards. Food was a major profit center. Prisoners who couldn't afford to buy meals from the jailer's kitchen were left to starve or depend on charity from their families. Those who could pay received marginally edible food at vastly inflated prices. Jailers often had exclusive contracts with local suppliers, creating monopolies that drove prices even higher. The quality of accommodation was directly proportional to your ability to pay. Wealthy prisoners could rent comfortable chambers with fireplaces, windows, and even private servants. They could receive visitors, conduct business, and live in relative luxury while awaiting trial or execution. Poor prisoners were chained in dungeons with no heat, no light, and no hope of improving their conditions. This created a bizarre social hierarchy within prisons. Wealthy murderers lived better than poor debtors. Noble traitors received better treatment than common thieves. Your crime mattered less than your credit rating, creating a justice system that explicitly favored the rich while grinding the poor into dust. Corruption was built into the system. Guards supplemented their income by accepting bribes for better treatment, for smuggling messages, or for looking the other way during escape attempts. Some guards ran gambling operations, brothels, or taverns within the prison walls. The most entrepreneurial jailers turned their prisons into entertainment venues, charging admission for public tours of the dungeons. The torture industry was equally profitable. Professional torturers charged by the session, with premium pricing for more elaborate techniques. Customers, usually courts or private individuals seeking revenge, could choose from a menu of services: basic beatings, advanced joint destruction, psychological trauma, or custom packages designed for specific victims. Execution was the ultimate premium service. Quick, clean beheadings were expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Hanging was the standard option for common criminals, but for those who couldn't afford proper execution fees, death became a prolonged public spectacle that generated additional revenue through ticket sales, food vendors, and souvenir merchants. The debt spiral was particularly vicious. Prisoners who couldn't pay their fees were charged interest. Those who couldn't pay interest were charged penalties. Medical treatment for injuries inflicted by guards required additional payments. Clean water cost extra. Even dying required fees for body removal and burial. Families often bankrupted themselves trying to keep imprisoned relatives alive. They sold property, livestock, and personal belongings to pay prison fees. Some families went into debt to money lenders at usurious rates, creating cycles of poverty that lasted for generations. The imprisonment of one family member often destroyed entire households financially. The system created perverse incentives for everyone involved. Judges were incentivized to send more people to prison because they often received kickbacks from jailers. Guards were incentivized to keep prisoners alive as long as possible because dead prisoners couldn't pay fees. Lawyers, when they existed, were incentivized to drag out cases to increase their fees, often paid by the same families already bankrupted by prison costs. Private individuals could essentially rent prison space for personal vendettas. If you had a business rival, romantic competitor, or annoying neighbor, you could pay to have them arrested on trumped-up charges and then pay additional fees to ensure they received especially harsh treatment. It was like hiring a hitman, except the victim died slowly and expensively. The church got involved in the prison business too because suffering was apparently good for the soul and profitable for the collection plate. Monastery prisons charged fees for spiritual guidance, which often meant having monks lecture starving prisoners about the virtues of poverty while collecting money from their families. Some entrepreneurial jailers diversified their revenue streams by running side businesses within the prison walls. They operated taverns where visitors could drink while watching prisoners suffer. They charged admission for public tours, marketing their dungeons as educational experiences or entertainment venues. Some even rented out prison space for private parties, because nothing says medieval fun like celebrating your birthday next to a torture chamber. The legal system itself became a money-making enterprise. Courts charged fees for hearings, for documentation, for appeals, and for verdicts. Justice wasn't blind, it was expensive. Poor defendants often couldn't afford to present evidence in their favor, while wealthy plaintiffs could buy witnesses, bribe judges, and purchase favorable outcomes. This economic model created a feedback loop of corruption that infected every level of medieval society. The more money involved in the prison system, the more people had financial incentives to keep it running at maximum capacity. Reform was bad for business, mercy was unprofitable, and justice was whatever generated the most revenue. The irony is that this for-profit prison system was often less efficient at deterring crime than modern rehabilitation-focused approaches. But it wasn't designed to reduce crime, it was designed to monetize crime. Every theft, every debt, every political disagreement became an opportunity for someone to profit from human suffering. Medieval prisons were essentially biological warfare laboratories where disease experimented on human subjects, with medieval science providing no defense and medieval medicine offering no hope. If the torture didn't kill you, if starvation didn't finish you off, and if violence didn't end your story, disease was waiting patiently to collect what the other horrors had missed. The conditions in medieval prisons created perfect breeding grounds for every pathogen known to the medieval world, and some that wouldn't be identified for centuries. Overcrowding meant that sick prisoners were pressed against healthy ones with no possibility of isolation. Poor ventilation meant that airborne diseases circulated freely through cramped spaces. Contaminated water and spoiled food introduced intestinal parasites and bacterial infections that could kill within days. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, turned prisons into charnel houses. Prisoners died so quickly that guards couldn't remove bodies fast enough. Some dungeons became mass graves where the living were chained next to the decomposing dead, breathing air thick with the smell of decay and the microscopic agents of their own doom. But plague wasn't the only killer stalking prison corridors. Typhus, spread by lice, thrived in the unwashed, overcrowded conditions. Prisoners would develop high fevers, delirium, and distinctive rashes before dying in agony. The disease spread so quickly through prison populations that it became known as jail fever, a term that made clear the connection between imprisonment and death. Dysentery turned prisons into landscapes of liquid waste and agony. Prisoners suffered from constant diarrhea, dehydration, and stomach cramps that left them writhing on floors already slick with their own bodily fluids. The dehydration was so severe that many prisoners died with their skin cracked and their tongues swollen black. The lucky ones died quickly, others lingered for weeks, growing thinner and weaker until their bodies simply gave up. Tuberculosis was perhaps the most insidious killer. The disease spread through the air in droplets from coughing prisoners, infecting cellmates who had no way to avoid exposure. Victims developed persistent coughs that brought up blood, night sweats that soaked their clothes, and a wasting condition that made them look like living skeletons. The medieval world called it consumption because it literally consumed its victims from the inside out. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was endemic in prison populations that rarely received fresh fruits or vegetables. Prisoners' teeth fell out, their gums bled constantly, and old wounds reopened without warning. Their skin became mottled with bruises, their joints swelled painfully, and they developed a distinctive odor that other prisoners learned to recognize as the smell of approaching death. Infections were death sentences in a world without antibiotics, A simple cut from rusty chains could turn gangrenous, filling prison air with the sickening smell of rotting flesh. Broken bones, common in torture sessions, often became infected when set improperly or not at all. Prisoners watched their own limbs turn black and die while they remained conscious and helpless. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through prison populations where rape was common and medical treatment was non-existent. Syphilis caused madness, blindness, and eventually death, but not before years of progressive deterioration that turned once healthy prisoners into raving lunatics covered with painful sores. The medieval understanding of disease was based on the theory of humors rather than germs, leading to treatments that often made patients sicker. Prisoners suffering from fever might be bled to reduce their excess blood, weakening them further when they needed strength to fight infection. Those with digestive problems might be purged with toxic substances that caused more damage to their already compromised systems. Mental illness was understood even less than physical disease. Prisoners who developed what we'd now recognize as severe depression, PTSD, or psychosis were assumed to be possessed by demons or punished by God for their sins. Treatment consisted of more chains, more isolation, and more abuse designed to drive out evil spirits. Suicide became a rational choice for many prisoners facing slow death from disease. But medieval Christianity considered suicide a mortal sin that would damn the soul to hell, so guards tried to prevent it. Prisoners were watched constantly, sharp objects were removed, and potential hanging points were eliminated. The irony was that guards worked to keep alive prisoners they were slowly torturing to death. Some diseases were so common in prisons that they became part of the expected experience. New prisoners were warned about prison fever, jail cough, and dungeon rot as inevitable aspects of incarceration. Families said goodbye to imprisoned relatives not because of their sentences, but because they knew they'd probably never survive the diseases that infested medieval prisons. The mortality rate in some medieval prisons approached 80% annually. Most prisoners didn't die from their official punishments, they died from the conditions of their confinement. Disease was judge, jury, and executioner, delivering death sentences to people whose crimes might have warranted only minor punishments. Medical care for prisoners was essentially non-existent. Doctors rarely visited prisons, partly because of the danger and partly because prisoners couldn't pay for treatment. The few medical interventions available were often worse than the diseases they were meant to treat. Prayer was prescribed more often than medicine, and faith was supposed to provide healing that medical knowledge couldn't deliver. The bodies of prisoners who died from disease were usually buried in unmarked graves or thrown into common pits outside prison walls. Their deaths weren't recorded, their families weren't notified, and their stories disappeared with their bodies. Disease didn't just kill medieval prisoners, it erased them from history. In a world where imprisonment often meant slow death, escape wasn't just tempting, it was a biological imperative. But medieval prison designers had centuries to perfect their craft, and they understood that hope itself could be weaponized. They built their dungeons not just to contain bodies, but to crush spirits, making escape seem so impossible that most prisoners never tried. But some did try, and their stories reveal both the incredible ingenuity of desperate humans and the creative cruelty of the people tasked with stopping them. Medieval prison breaks required resources most prisoners didn't have: time, tools, accomplices, and most importantly, the physical strength to overcome malnutrition and disease. Successful escapes often took months or years of preparation, with prisoners slowly chipping away at mortar with smuggled metal pieces, loosening stones during the few minutes they were unchained, or corrupting guards with bribes that represented their families' life savings. The Tower of London saw numerous escape attempts over the centuries, each one more desperate than the last. In 1244, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn IV, a Welsh prince, attempted to escape from the White Tower by lowering himself down the wall on a rope made from bed sheets and clothing. The improvised rope snapped and he fell to his death on the rocks below. His body was left there for days as a warning to other prisoners who might harbor similar ambitions. John Gerard, a Jesuit priest imprisoned in the Tower in 1597, managed one of the most spectacular escapes in the fortress's history. After months of planning, he and fellow prisoner John Arden used a rope to climb across the moat to waiting boats. Gerard had previously endured torture that left his hands permanently damaged, making his rope climb even more remarkable. His detailed account of the escape, written years later, reveals the psychological warfare between prisoners and guards. But successful escapes were rare enough to become legendary. Most attempts ended in recapture, and the consequences for failed escapees were designed to discourage others from trying. Recaptured prisoners faced punishments that made their original sentences seem merciful. They might be moved to worse cells, chained more securely, or subjected to public torture sessions designed to break their will and entertain the crowds. Some prisons developed specialized punishments for escape attempts. The oubliette was often the destination for prisoners who tried to flee, a vertical shaft where they'd be lowered and forgotten, left to die slowly in darkness, while other prisoners could hear their cries as a reminder of what happened to those who dared hope for freedom. Prison design evolved constantly to counter new escape methods. When prisoners started using spoons to dig through mortar, jailers began serving food with their hands or pieces of bread. When prisoners started corrupting guards, authorities implemented systems where multiple guards had to be present for any prisoner interaction. When prisoners started using visitors to smuggle tools, visits were conducted through iron bars with guards listening to every conversation. The psychological impact of failed escape attempts was devastating. Prisoners who had spent months planning and preparing, who had allowed themselves to hope for freedom, faced the crushing realization that their situation was truly hopeless. Many fell into deep depressions that killed them more surely than any disease. Others became model prisoners, their spirits so completely broken that they no longer posed any threat. Group escapes were both more common and more dangerous than individual attempts. Multiple prisoners could combine their resources, skills, and knowledge to overcome obstacles that would stop a single person. But groups were also harder to conceal, more likely to be betrayed by informants, and more likely to face severe consequences when recaptured. The famous Newgate prison break of 1750 involved dozens of prisoners who overpowered guards during a shift change. They flooded out into London streets, creating chaos as they scattered in different directions. But the freedom was temporary. Most were recaptured within days, and their punishment was severe enough to discourage similar attempts for decades. Underground tunneling was a popular escape method, but medieval prison builders had anticipated this strategy. Many dungeons were carved from solid rock or built on foundations that made tunneling impossible. Others were constructed with deep moats or underground chambers filled with water that would flood any tunnel attempts. Some prisoners tried to escape through official channels, attempting to bribe judges, corrupt court officials, or convince witnesses to change their testimony. These legal escape attempts were often more expensive than physical breakouts, but sometimes more successful, especially for prisoners whose crimes hadn't generated significant public attention. The involvement of outside accomplices was crucial for most successful escapes, but also represented the greatest risk. Family members or friends who helped prisoners escape faced imprisonment themselves, creating moral dilemmas for prisoners who had to choose between their own freedom and their loved ones' safety. Disguise and deception were common escape tactics. Prisoners dressed as guards, clergy, or merchants to walk out of prisons in plain sight. Some convinced guards they were dead and had themselves carried out in body carts. Others hid in laundry bundles or food deliveries, enduring hours of discomfort for moments of freedom. The timing of escape attempts was crucial. Prisoners studied guard routines, shift changes, and seasonal patterns to identify the best opportunities. Religious holidays were popular for escape attempts because guards were often drunk or distracted by celebrations. But they were also times when escaped prisoners would stand out more in communities gathered for worship. Weather played a crucial role in escape planning. Winter attempts faced the challenge of freezing temperatures and trackable footprints in snow, but also offered longer nights for concealment. Summer escapes provided better survival conditions but less darkness to hide movement. Storms could provide cover for noise but also made travel dangerous. The aftermath of failed escape attempts often destroyed not just the prisoners involved but their families as well. Authorities would interrogate family members, torture accomplices, and sometimes execute innocent people suspected of providing assistance. The medieval justice system operated on the principle that escape attempts were not just crimes against the prison, but crimes against the social order that deserved collective punishment. Some prisoners became legends within prison walls, not for successful escapes, but for spectacular failures. Their stories were told and retold by new prisoners as both inspiration and warning. These tales became part of prison folklore, passed down through generations of inmates who found meaning in the courage of those who dared to try, even when they failed. The psychological torture of near success was particularly cruel. Prisoners who made it to the outer walls only to be caught, who reached the streets only to be recognized, or who lived free for days before recapture, experienced a taste of freedom that made their return to captivity even more unbearable. Guards sometimes deliberately allowed escape attempts to proceed further than they should have, enjoying the psychological impact of snatching hope away at the last moment. Medieval punishment wasn't just about inflicting pain on criminals, it was about creating a theatrical experience that educated, entertained, and terrified the general population. Public executions, torture sessions, and prisoner parades were the medieval equivalent of reality television, morality plays, and horror movies, all rolled into one spectacular package that drew crowds from across the countryside. The scaffold was the medieval world's most popular entertainment venue. Public executions drew thousands of spectators who treated them like festivals, bringing food, alcohol, and their entire families to witness the destruction of human beings. These weren't somber affairs focused on justice. They were carnivals where death was the main attraction and human suffering was the featured entertainment. The condemned were paraded through streets on carts, surrounded by crowds who threw rotting vegetables, human waste, and insults. These processions could take hours, winding through major streets to ensure maximum visibility. The prisoners were often forced to wear signs describing their crimes, costumes that mocked their former status, or symbols that identified them as enemies of God and King. Execution methods were chosen for their theatrical impact as much as their lethal efficiency. Hanging was common, but relatively quick, so it was often enhanced with additional tortures. Drawing and quartering provided maximum spectacle. The victim was dragged through streets behind horses, then hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still conscious, and finally cut into pieces for display in different parts of the city. Burning was reserved for heretics and witches, creating a slow-motion death that could last for hours. The condemned were tied to stakes, surrounded by carefully arranged kindling designed to burn hot enough to cause agony, but slow enough to prevent quick death. Skilled executioners could keep victims conscious and screaming for extended periods, while crowds cheered or prayed depending on their perspective on the prisoner's guilt. Beheading was considered merciful and was usually reserved for nobility, but even this quick death was turned into public theatre. The condemned were forced to kneel in front of crowds, often after delivering speeches written by authorities that confessed their crimes and warned others against similar behavior. The executioner's axe or sword might require multiple strikes, each one accompanied by cheers or groans from the audience. Professional executioners became celebrities in their own right, traveling from city to city to practice their craft at major events. They developed signature techniques, signature costumes, and even signature last words for their victims. Some executioners were known for their precision, others for their creativity, and a few for their showmanship that turned deaths into memorable performances. The crowds at public executions were diverse and enthusiastic. Merchants closed shops to attend, farmers traveled from distant villages, and families brought children to witness the educational spectacle. Food vendors sold refreshments, pickpockets worked the crowds, and prostitutes conducted business while everyone's attention was focused on the scaffold. But the entertainment value wasn't limited to executions. Public torture sessions drew their own audiences of people who enjoyed watching human beings systematically destroyed. The rack, the wheel, and various burning implements were set up in town squares where crowds could observe every stage of the victim's deterioration. Pillories and stocks provided ongoing entertainment for communities. Prisoners locked in these devices faced hours or days of public humiliation as passers-by threw waste, spit on them, or pelted them with stones. Some victims died from exposure or injuries inflicted by enthusiastic crowds, but their deaths were considered accidental byproducts of legitimate punishment. The Church played a crucial role in legitimizing these spectacles, providing theological justification for public torture and execution. Priests delivered sermons at execution sites, explaining how the condemned's suffering was necessary for social order and divine justice. They led prayers for the victims' souls while simultaneously celebrating their destruction. These public displays served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. They were advertisements for royal and church power, demonstrations of what happened to those who challenged authority. They were educational tools that taught legal and moral lessons to illiterate populations, and they were social bonding experiences that united communities around shared values and shared enemies. Children were specifically encouraged to attend public executions and torture sessions as educational experiences. Parents explained the crimes and punishments, used the condemned as examples of moral failure, and created lasting memories that would influence their children's behavior for life. Medieval childhood education included regular exposure to systematic violence presented as normal and necessary. The condemned sometimes became unwilling performers in their own destruction, forced to play roles written by their executioners. They were required to confess publicly, to beg forgiveness from God and King, and to warn others against following their path. Those who refused to cooperate faced additional tortures designed to break their resistance and force compliance. Some prisoners attempted to control their final narrative by delivering unauthorized speeches, maintaining their innocence, or cursing their accusers. But executioners had techniques for silencing uncooperative victims, cutting out tongues, breaking jaws, or simply proceeding with the execution before the prisoner could speak. The body parts of executed criminals became souvenirs and relics. Hands, heads, and other pieces were displayed on city walls, bridge entrances, and castle gates as permanent reminders of royal justice. Some communities developed traditions around these displays, updating them regularly and taking pride in their collections of human remains. The psychological impact of these public spectacles was profound and lasting. Communities that regularly witnessed public torture and execution developed cultural norms that accepted extreme violence as entertainment. Children raised on these displays grew into adults who considered human suffering a legitimate form of recreation. The medical community sometimes benefited from public executions, gaining access to fresh corpses for anatomical study. Physicians would bid for the rights to executed criminals' bodies, creating a market where human remains became valuable commodities for scientific research. The intersection of entertainment, education, and violence in medieval public executions reveals fundamental aspects of medieval culture that modern people struggle to understand. These weren't aberrations or exceptions, they were central institutions that shaped social values, legal understanding, and moral frameworks for entire societies. The medieval prison system didn't disappear overnight in a burst of enlightenment and humanitarian reform. It died slowly, poisoned by its own contradictions and gradually replaced by ideas that were almost as radical as the original system had been conservative. The transformation took centuries and happened for reasons that had more to do with economics and politics than with sudden compassion for human suffering. By the late medieval period, the costs of maintaining the traditional prison system were becoming unsustainable. The fee-based model that had enriched jailers and judges was also bankrupting communities that had to deal with the social costs of destroying so many of their members. Families impoverished by prison fees became burdens on local charity systems. Communities lost productive workers to imprisonment and execution. The system was consuming itself. The rise of centralized monarchies challenged the localized, privatized justice system that had characterized medieval law enforcement. Kings wanted to control justice as a tool of royal power rather than leaving it to local entrepreneurs. This meant standardizing punishments, regulating prison conditions, and bringing the entire system under royal control rather than local management. The Protestant Reformation inadvertently contributed to prison reform by challenging the Catholic Church's monopoly on moral authority. Protestant reformers questioned whether suffering in this life actually benefited souls in the next, undermining theological justifications for torture and extreme punishment. Some Protestant regions began experimenting with less brutal forms of justice, though their motives were more theological than humanitarian. Economic changes also pressured the old system. The growth of trade and commerce created new types of crimes that didn't fit traditional punishment models. Commercial fraud, currency manipulation, and international trade disputes required legal solutions more sophisticated than public flogging or execution. The medieval system was built for an agricultural, feudal society and couldn't adapt to commercial capitalism. The printing press spread new ideas about justice, law, and human nature faster than ever before. Legal scholars could study Roman law, compare different legal systems, and propose reforms based on systematic analysis rather than local tradition. Books like Cesare Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments introduced concepts like proportional punishment and rehabilitation that challenged medieval assumptions about justice. Renaissance humanism contributed new ideas about human dignity and individual worth that were incompatible with medieval prison practices. Humanist scholars argued that humans were capable of moral improvement through education and reason rather than just punishment and fear. These ideas slowly percolated through educated society and began influencing legal reforms. The emergence of professional standing armies reduced reliance on public violence as a tool of social control. Medieval societies had used public executions and torture partly because they lacked other ways to enforce order. Professional military and police forces provided alternative methods of maintaining stability without requiring regular displays of extreme violence. Colonial expansion created new problems that medieval justice couldn't solve. What do you do with large populations of criminals when execution would waste potential labor and traditional imprisonment was too expensive? The answer was transportation to colonies, a punishment that was simultaneously more humane than medieval torture and more economically productive than execution. Medical advances, particularly better understanding of disease transmission, made traditional prison conditions obviously counterproductive. Prisons that regularly killed their inmates through disease outbreaks were clearly not serving their intended purpose of deterring crime. Reform became a practical necessity rather than just a moral aspiration. The rise of insurance and banking created new economic models that required predictable legal systems. Commercial contracts, property rights, and international trade needed legal frameworks that provided certainty rather than the arbitrary violence that characterized medieval justice. Business required rule of law, not rule of fear. Educational expansion created larger literate populations who could read about legal reforms, compare different systems, and advocate for change. The medieval system had thrived partly because most people couldn't read about alternatives. Literacy created constituencies for reform that hadn't existed in earlier centuries. Women's increasing economic importance in some regions led to gradual recognition that that destroying half the population through systematic abuse was economically wasteful. This wasn't feminism in any modern sense, but rather recognition that women represented economic resources that shouldn't be squandered through excessive violence. The gradual development of concepts like individual rights, due process, and proportional punishment created intellectual frameworks for systematic reform. Medieval law had been based on tradition, divine command, and royal will. Early modern law began incorporating ideas about natural rights and rational legal procedures. Some regions experimented with alternative punishments that were less expensive than imprisonment and more productive than execution. Workhouses, debtors' prisons with earning opportunities, and supervised labor programs provided models for punishment systems that generated revenue rather than just consuming it. The growth of international trade required legal systems that foreign merchants could understand and trust. The arbitrary violence and corruption of medieval justice drove away international business. Economic competition between regions incentivized legal reforms that would attract commercial activity. Religious wars and political upheavals revealed the costs of systems based on absolute authority and arbitrary punishment. Communities that had been decimated by religious persecution or political violence began questioning whether extreme punishment actually promoted social stability or just created cycles of revenge and resistance. But the transition was gradual and uneven. Some regions maintained essentially medieval prison systems well into the 18th or 19th centuries. Others reformed selectively, maintaining brutal punishments for some crimes while moderating others. The old system fought back through inertia, vested interests, and cultural traditions that normalized extreme violence. The medieval prison system didn't die because people suddenly became more compassionate. It died because it stopped working economically, politically, and socially. The replacement systems weren't necessarily more humane. They were more efficient at achieving their goals of social control and economic productivity. So here we are at the end of our journey through humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. We've walked through dungeons that would make modern horror writers weep with envy, examined torture devices that turned human suffering into an art form, and witnessed justice systems that made arbitrary violence seem reasonable and necessary. But before you close this chapter of history and return to your centrally heated home with its constitutional protections and clean running water, let's take a moment to consider what we've really learned about human nature, social systems, and the thin line between civilization and barbarism. The medieval prison system wasn't created by monsters or psychopaths. It was built by ordinary people who believed they were creating a just and orderly society. They genuinely thought that public torture would deter crime, that systematic brutality would maintain social stability, and that destroying individual human beings would serve the greater good of their communities. Every torture device was invented by someone who probably loved their family, attended religious services, and considered themselves a moral person. Every dungeon was designed by architects who went home to comfortable beds and peaceful meals. Every execution was carried out by professionals who saw their work as necessary public service. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of medieval prison history. The capacity for cruelty isn't limited to obviously evil people. It emerges from systems, from cultures that normalize violence, and from societies that convince themselves that their brutality serves higher purposes. The medieval world looked at a hungry child stealing bread and saw a criminal who needed to be punished severely to deter other hungry children from similar crimes. They looked at political dissidents and saw threats to social order who needed to be destroyed publicly to discourage others from questioning authority. They looked at religious minorities and saw spiritual poison that needed to be purged through systematic torture. But they weren't uniquely evil. They were humans operating within systems that had evolved to prioritize order over justice, fear over rehabilitation, and spectacular violence over effective crime prevention. They inherited traditions of cruelty and passed them on to their children as normal and necessary aspects of civilized society. The gradual replacement of medieval prison systems with more humane alternatives happened not because people suddenly became more compassionate, but because the old systems stopped working effectively. Economic changes, political developments, and social evolution made extreme brutality counterproductive rather than useful. This suggests that our own, more humane legal systems aren't necessarily permanent achievements of human moral progress. They exist because they serve our current economic, political, and social needs. If those needs change, if our societies face different challenges, or if our political systems evolve in different directions, the protections we take for granted could disappear as quickly as they developed. Modern prison systems, while vastly more humane than their medieval predecessors, still reflect many of the same underlying assumptions about crime, punishment, and social control. We still use imprisonment to remove inconvenient people from society. We still believe that punishment deters crime, despite limited evidence for that belief. We still struggle with questions about rehabilitation versus retribution. The medieval period shows us what happens when those assumptions are taken to their logical extremes without constitutional protections, due process rights, or humanitarian constraints. The torture chambers and death dungeons weren't aberrations. They were the natural evolution of punishment-focused justice systems that prioritized social control over individual rights. Perhaps the most important lesson from medieval prison history is that civilization is fragile and reversible. The legal protections, humanitarian values, and institutional safeguards that prevent us from returning to medieval-style justice systems require constant vigilance and active maintenance. They can be eroded gradually through fear, emergency legislation, and cultural changes that normalize increasing levels of state violence. Every generation has to choose whether to maintain, strengthen, or abandon the humanitarian progress inherited from previous generations. The medieval world shows us what abandonment looks like: systematic dehumanization, normalized cruelty, and societies that convince themselves that brutality serves justice. But medieval history also shows us human resilience, creativity, and the persistent hope that drives people to resist even the most oppressive systems. Prisoners carved messages into dungeon walls, families bankrupted themselves to keep loved ones alive, and communities gradually developed more humane alternatives to inherited traditions of violence. The people who suffered in medieval prisons weren't fundamentally different from us. They loved their families, hoped for better futures, and tried to maintain their humanity in systems designed to destroy it. Their stories remind us that individual dignity persists even in the worst circumstances, that hope survives even systematic attempts to crush it. Today, when you turn on a light switch, drink clean water from a tap, or call a lawyer when arrested, you're benefiting from centuries of gradual progress away from the medieval model of justice through violence. These aren't natural or inevitable human achievements. They're cultural artifacts that required conscious effort to create and require conscious effort to maintain. The dungeons, torture chambers, and execution grounds of medieval Europe stand today as museums, tourist attractions, and historical curiosities. We visit them with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, comfortable in our assumption that such places belong firmly in the past. But they're also warnings about what humans are capable of when fear overrides compassion, when order matters more than justice, and when societies convince themselves that cruelty serves higher purposes. They remind us that the choice between civilization and barbarism is one that every generation must make consciously and repeatedly. So, as you leave this dark journey through medieval prison history, remember that you're not just learning about the past, you're examining possibilities that still exist in human nature and social systems,